know Jordan Poole.
Now, back to Willard and Dibs on 95.7 The Game.
Man, it's tough. I mean, I'm going to acknowledge that. The human side of this, 23 years old, and the world is looking at you and talking about you in the middle of a LeBron-Steph series and asking you to be different and be better and what it must feel like, the pressure that Jordan Poole will take to the floor at crypto-whatever.arena tonight. It's real. I get it. And it's been a journey this year, no doubt, and excited to have a conversation here on Willard and Dibs with former NBA player and now great analyst Greg Anthony joining us on the show. Hey, Greg, man, thanks for coming on. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. And Dan, how are you guys?
We're doing fantastic, man, and we're super curious about what you wrote on Twitter. The NBA on ESPN sends out a tweet about Jordan Poole's struggles, and your commentary above it was curious. Anyone think that he didn't take a leap this year because of something traumatic occurring before the season started? Hashtag asking for a friend. Well, we'll be your friend, Greg, and why don't you go ahead and give us the answer to the question in your opinion?
Well, listen. The Warriors have had a challenging regular season. We all know that. The roster is not as filled with some of the veteran-type players they had from the championship a season ago. And obviously, being a young player, you would have thought that coming off the performance in the finals, signing a new contract, all those things would be positives, which they are. And typically players that age, they tend to take another step once the team has told them they're as good as they think they are, right, by giving them the contract. And my point was this. First, let me preface it by saying I'm a huge Draymond Green fan. I'm a huge Warriors fan. I think what they've accomplished will go down as one of the great dynasties this game has ever seen. And while there have been teams that have won more, it's all relative, right? Because in this era, with free agency, we've never had that before. The game, the level of which is being played, we've never seen before. Just case in point, what we witnessed last night in that Phoenix and Denver game. That's as high a level of basketball as I've ever seen anyone play it from an offensive standpoint. And so, when you take all those things into consideration, and then you factor in what the fabric of a team is, right? Like, as a kid growing up, and you guys probably played sports, one of the first things you're taught is that a team is family, right? It's your family. You got families fight, family do all these things. And you're also taught that there's always consequence for your actions. And for me, to have that video leaked and what transpired and how it transpired, I don't care who you are, that's going to affect you, right? It just is. And then, relatively speaking, there was really no consequence for that action, right? Like, well, Draymond's going to have a few games away. We can't have him miss the ring ceremony. And I'm just saying to myself, wow, man, that would really affect a lot of people. It just would. And I got some responses from people saying, that had nothing to do with it. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't even know how you could not think it would have something to do with it. And I went and looked at his numbers. I was like, man, he's down across the board on all his numbers. In a situation where you would have thought coming in, he'd have the highest level of confidence, right? You just won a championship. You just got your bag. They're telling you how important you are. I was like, you're familiar with the system, the role, the responsibility. And I started thinking about it. I was like, man, and I felt this when it happened, and I said it when it happened. I thought that this would have long-term consequences. I felt like it could have an impact on that team because going through stuff like that, man, just didn't happen. You fight, right? Siblings fight, teammates fight. Lord knows I was a part of a lot of fights in practice. But typically they're fights, right? Like it's typically a give and take in situations like that. That wasn't the case. And again, I'm not here to admonish Draymond. I love him. He knows he was wrong in that moment. But it just does speak to a bigger issue because typically, and I think it shows on the road, right? Why? Because the road is where you face the most adversity. And typically if you're close in those adverse moments is when you tend to come together. And so even in that game 7, we go back and Steph was incredible. But, they didn't have a lot of other guys play great in that game. And that's been so what the Warriors have always been about, is that collectively they've been their best in the biggest moments. And so I was wondering about that. And again, I was putting it out just for conversational purposes. But I do think that if you're kidding yourself, if you don't think that has played a role in the psyche of Jordan Poole this season.
Greg Anthony here on 95.7 The Game. You mentioned fights. Bigger fights with Stacy and Larry and Anderson at UNLV or in New York with Charles, and I don't know if Allen Houston, I'm a lover, not a fighter, but certainly, Charles Oakley. Would anyone want to mess with him in the Garden?
No. Well, listen, we had fights that involved coaches in practice.
Wow.
It was really an intense environment, and I was somewhat it was also a sign of the times. I was also somewhat accustomed to it because we had some of that in college. And I do think, listen, anytime you have really intense environments where there's a high level of accountability and high expectations, that tends to bring emotion into play. So, yeah, you do get that. There's no doubt about it. But I would say more so professionally because, the expectations were high, the nature of how we played and who we were as a team. There's no way you weren't going to have fights on a regular basis in that environment.
Greg, your answer about Jordan and the situation around it is really interesting. And so when you talk about the lack of consequences, which was something we discussed at the time for sure, I wonder if you think that or anything else throughout the year, what could the Warriors have done to help Jordan through this process and maybe be getting something better out of him at this point, if anything, in your opinion?
Well, listen, again, I don't want to say that that's the sole reason why he hasn't been as good, because I don't necessarily think that. But my point was he didn't take another step like maybe we thought he would. And it doesn't mean you have to average more points, but typically you become more efficient, right? You got another year under your belt, another offseason, you get better. I just think that mentally that affected him. And I would say this, listen, and it was a perfect opportunity. They could have suspended Draymond, early in the season. And at the very least, it tells him and the team, whether it's just like being a parent, right? Even though you love your kids, their actions still bring about consequence. Doesn't mean you don't love them. Doesn't mean you aren't going to be there to support them. But you have to show everybody that we still have consequences for our actions. And I just felt like, in essence, there really wasn't a punishment. And then I forget who it was, but someone within the organization came out and said, well, we didn't want to have Draymond miss ring night because, that wouldn't have been right. And I was saying when I heard that, I was like, wow, I can't wait to see how this is going to play out.
And it's still
that to me, I thought, again, that just, ask yourself if you're in that situation. I always tell, put yourself in Jordan Poole's shoes. And I'm not saying that Jordan Poole's a great teammate because I don't know the inner workings and the machinations of what's going on. But if you put yourself in that situation and that happened to you, and then that video is out for the whole world to see, do you really think that just goes away, that doesn't rear itself in your mind at different points over the course of the season? I would think it does.
Yeah, especially what you were saying, Greg, is there was no real retribution for Draymond Green. So Jordan Poole takes the punch, and Draymond Green basically, quote, gets away with it scot-free. Do you think part of Jordan's struggle is the fact that he sometimes starts, he comes off the bench? I'm looking at your career, and you kind of had a similar thing where at times you started, a lot of times you came off the bench. What's the mentality of a player who is kind of toggling between starter and bench player?
Listen, there's no doubt there's an adjustment. It absolutely is. The only thing I would say in some regards in his case, though, a lot of times what changes is your role when you go from starter to bench player or from bench to starter. And I don't know that the role changed per se. Keep in mind, they didn't have Wiggins for basically almost the entire second half of the season. So that would have lent itself for him to have more opportunity. And remember, they were still trying to figure out a rotation. Some of the young guys were in, were out, the whole nine. So they've had a lot go on this season. But I just do think ultimately, if things don't end the way this team would like, with the season they had, and then if it doesn't, materialize in this postseason, those are going to be questions that are going to have to be asked and addressed in the offseason.
You're listening to 95.7 The Game, KGMZ, FM, and HD1 San Francisco. Always live on Twitch, YouTube, and the free Odyssey app. Willard and Dibs talking with Greg Anthony here on the build-up to Game 4 between the Lakers and the Warriors. Greg, you're doing great stuff on Twitter, obviously, because I keep getting interested by what you're saying. I want to read another one and have you expand. Just this morning, you wrote about tonight, the Warriors shoot threes better and limit turnovers. 2 of Wiggins, Thompson, or Poole have to be great, and maybe a Kuminga sighting. For the Lakers, 2 of Russell, Reeves, or Dennis have to play well. AD sets the tone defensively and transition offense. And then you write, notice who I didn't mention, which is obviously Steph and LeBron. So would you expand on that, please? What do you mean by what needs to happen for each team tonight?
Well, I think that in Steph's case, the defense is going to have somewhat of an impact on him because they're selling out to take away certain things from him, right? And we saw in the second game that they did that, and it made him into a passer, but other guys stepped up because you saw that the incredible game that Klay had. And I thought they also did Draymond switching on to AD. AD hadn't felt his force or intensity defensively, and he kind of wilted. He wasn't ready for it, right? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like, I don't worry about Steph or LeBron. And you saw it in Game 3 with LeBron. He didn't take a shot for, I think it was about 10 minutes.
Yep.
And that had never happened before. But LeBron also in year 20 knows I can't go for 40 every night. I can't extend myself both ends every play for 40 minutes every night either. So I got to defer and hope that these other guys step up. And similarly, in those 2 wins that they've had, everybody talks about how great AD's been, but D'Angelo Russell's been terrific. Dennis Schroeder's been really good for them. And so they've had other guys who've been able to kind of carry some of the load. And I think that's similarly what's got to happen tonight. I think with the supporting cast, and it's always more of a challenge for you when you're on the road. I do think Steph will play and be aggressive, and I think he's going to be effective. But I don't think this Lakers team is not Sacramento. It's going to take more than just Steph. Draymond's going to have to also be what he was in Game 2 in terms of having an impact on the game. So it sets up for a really interesting night. I think there's great anticipation. I also feel like, unlike even Sacramento, I think there was a high level of confidence that no matter what or how dire it might have looked, that Golden State would figure out a way to prevail. And I felt like they had the smarter players in the game play for Golden State. That's not necessarily the case when LeBron James is on the floor. And so I think that creates a little more anxiety for Golden State because you don't know if some of those guys, you talked about it with Jordan Poole, we don't know what kind of impact he's going to have. Does Kuminga get an opportunity because they could use a little more athleticism, right, out on the floor? It just sets up, I think, for the chess match between Kerr and Darvin Ham, and we'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
How tough is it for a 20-year-old Kuminga who's been mothballed for the majority of this series other than garbage time? How do you get him dusted off and ready to go for actual meaningful minutes in a series this high profile?
Listen, when you're 20, you don't have to dust off. He's chomping at the bit. He's fired up and ready to go. In fact, if anything, you got to harness his energy to be focused on the game plan. So I wouldn't even remotely be concerned about that. I think the bigger issue is what kind of job has the leadership on the team and the coaching staff done to keep him engaged. right, to get a sense of his mindset. And I thought, it's a little thing, but watching the end of the last game when he got a chance to play, I thought he looked good. And that tells you something, right? He wasn't moping. He wasn't feeling sorry for himself. He came out and he was really trying to put forth great effort and play and have a positive impact. So that's a positive sign. And I think that's something that you're going to have to see if you're Steve Kerr. They're going to have to do something differently, right? They put the ball in Steph's hands far more in game 2. And he was a facilitator and guys made shots and they played at a really high level. The last game, it was the turnovers and it was the inability of anybody else to have an impact on the perimeter. And so I do think that you could see a scenario where he gets an opportunity maybe early in that first half just to see, where you can't lose. You're not going to lose it in the first half, right? You might see him come into the game and just to see if his athleticism can have an impact on the game.
So, Greg, you're alluding to it a little bit, but do you feel the adjustment is out there or not? What do you think happens eventually in this series?
Oh, it's still wide open. I really do feel like the winner of tonight has the best chance to win the series. Let's face it. And I'm not going way out on a limb, but that means if Golden State goes 2-2, that puts them back in the driver's seat, right? Makes the best 2 out of 3 with 2 of them in the Bay Area. So I think both teams understand that, and I think the both best players really understand that. And so I do think that you're going to see Steph and LeBron be far more aggressive, not necessarily to score it, but to put their fingerprints on the outcome of the game. And so I think we're going to all be in for a great treat tonight, and it's going to be a lot of intensity on that floor.
Yeah, I like that take a lot. Greg, are you on TV? Are you on NBA TV after the game tonight?
No. I'm off. I'll be watching like everybody else.
Okay, man.
Looking forward to it, though.
Kick your feet up and make some good food and enjoy, man. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks.
Okay, good luck, guys.
All right, there he goes. Greg Anthony with us here on Willard and Dibs.